Welcome to the Human Factor, the LinkedIn Live of Inc. and Fast Company. I'm Eric Schurenberg, the CEO of Inc. and Fast Company. In the Bible story, God offers to grant young King Solomon anything he wishes. When Solomon asks for wisdom rather than, say, riches or long life, God is pleasantly surprised and so throws in riches and longevity as a kind of daily double. Well, today's guest, Chip Conley, a Solomon in his own way, also recognizes the value of wisdom and has devoted much of the past decade to helping that often underappreciated virtue regain its standing in the workplace, in life, and in the minds of those who have it in abundance, people in midlife. But before he became the evangelist of wisdom, it must be said that Chip did pretty well in the riches and longevity department as well. He's the founder of Joie de Vivre Hotels, the nation's second largest chain of boutique hotels, which he ran as CEO for 24 years before joining Airbnb as a strategic advisor and mentor to CEO Brian Chesky. Airbnb is about to go public. Wise move there, Chip. Anyway, Chip, welcome. So delighted to have you here on The Human Factor.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be with you.
Now, in our previous conversations, I always invited you to begin the story of your wisdom journey with the day that Brian Chesky asked you to be his mentor. But for this one, let's go back a little bit further. It could be argued that your wisdom journey began a few years before that, when after a string of confronting experiences, everything came to a head on August 19th, 2008, the day your heart stopped.
Wow, you're going for it, my friend.
I am. So tell us about that. What happened and how did that change your life?
So thank you. I started Joie de Vivre, means joy of life in French, in San Francisco, boutique hotel company. We grew to 52 boutique hotels over the course of 24 years. But about 22 years into it, I was starting to have second thoughts about, not second thoughts, I actually was, what had happened was what had become a calling in my life, all of a sudden overnight felt like it was a job. And there were a lot of reasons for that. And then this was 2008 when a lot of other things were going on, obviously the Great Recession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I got a bacterial infection in my leg because I broke my ankle and had a cut on my leg. And then I was put on an antibiotic and I was allergic to it. And after giving a speech on stage in St. Louis while I was signing books, I went unconscious first, and then I went flatline multiple times. Kept being brought back to life. So, to be an entrepreneur who's started their own company, my whole identity as an adult was being founder and CEO of this company. It forced me to come face to face with, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? Especially when, I died earlier today. I could die at any time. Tony Hsieh, such a good friend of mine, has written forward of two of my books, passed away, before his 47th birthday, which would have been next week. And so you don't know when it's going to happen, which is part of the reason why you have to ask yourself, okay, is this what I want to continue to be doing? And the answer I came out of that hospital with was no. I got to figure out a way to sell my company because I want to open up space in my life to see what's supposed to happen next.
Wow. Well, one of the things that happened next was one of your 5 books, Emotional Equations, which is a very charming concept in which emotions and states of being are represented as mathematical equations. And the one about wisdom is intriguing. So in the book, wisdom equals the square root of experience. What does that mean?
What does that mean exactly? In fact, strangely enough, it's the last chapter of the book. So I had no idea that I was about to go on a wisdom journey when I wrote this book, and it came out in January 2012. And it was a year later that I heard from the Airbnb guys. But let me tell you, what does that equation mean? Wisdom is the square root of experience. So a square root, and I'm not a math major at all, but a square root distills down a bigger number into something that's more essential, into a smaller number. So the square root of 16, I guess, would be 4, if I'm not mistaken. And for those, if I am mistaken, you're the math major, you know what I'm talking about. But what it means is that wisdom is all about taking all of this information and distilling information and knowledge into insight that is maybe actionable. And so that was the last chapter of that book. That book was a New York Times bestseller, and I sort of thought, okay, now that this has happened, it's time for me to just go and write a few more books. That was my fourth book, and then I got this call from Brian.
Wow. All right. Well, let's jump to that too, because that is such a another beginning of a new chapter in your life. Brian Chesky, young enough to be your son, invites you to be a strategic advisor at Airbnb, and his.
Well, actually, he invited me. He invited me to be the head of global hospitality and strategy, and I actually did that for 4 years. So I did that for 4 years, and then I became a strategic advisor. So what Brian said to me, Eric, I'm sorry that I interrupted, but I want to make sure I was able to tell you what actually happened. He asked me to join the company to be his in-house mentor and the head of global hospitality and strategy, because this is a company with a couple hundred employees starting to go global, but a small tech company that just had no one in it with any hospitality or travel or frankly entrepreneurship background in the B2C world. So I said yes, but then I realized almost overnight, like, okay, I'm going to be reporting to this guy 21 years younger than me, but I'm also his mentor. What's that going to be like? But I was also joining a tech company for the first time. And so for 4 years, I worked full-time, 70 hours a week in that role, and helped groom helped groom Brian into being a leader who, next week will be ringing the bell. Well, I guess he won't be ringing the bell. He'll be doing whatever they do for NASDAQ. Because they ring a bell on the New York Stock Exchange, but I don't know what they do for NASDAQ. And I still am in that role with him as his in-house mentor.
He brought you on because of your industry wisdom, but I got one way to read the story of your book, Wisdom at Work, is that what that grew into was a relationship based on life wisdom and leadership wisdom, not just industrial experience.
It's interesting. It's an interesting insight, Eric, because he said about 3 months into it, he said to me, Chip, we hired you, me and my two co-founders, we hired you for your knowledge even. He said that. We hired you for your knowledge, but what we really got was your wisdom. And I'd never really thought about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And frankly, knowledge is something you accumulate. It's like an addition equation, add. And wisdom's the opposite. It's like a division equation or a square root where you're actually distilling down. And so one of the things that I've been curious about is that, Peter Drucker is one of my heroes, no longer living. He wrote two-thirds of his 40 books after the age of 65. Peter Drucker coined the term knowledge worker in 1959 because he said the future of the business world and the organizational world will be ruled by knowledge workers. And in fact, today, 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world are tech companies, the ultimate place where knowledge workers hang their hat. So I think what Brian was saying to me and what he and I riffed off of was the idea of like, wow, what if we're moving from the era of the knowledge worker, because all of the knowledge of the world is right in this little machine in my hand. But instead of what's really scarce is wisdom workers. And a wisdom worker in my role as a wisdom worker with Brian, my role was to help accelerate his process of cultivating and harvesting his own wisdom. And I actually think that role is going to become more and more prevalent in the future because there are going to be a growing number of young people starting companies that become disruptors overnight, but they often it's ideal for them to be paired with someone who might have some wisdom that they can offer. And the truth is, I learned as much from Brian as he learned from me. But there were a few qualities and skills and wisdom that I could offer him.
That is a great story, and one hopes it really does become a model for the future. Are there things you can point to at Airbnb that are marks that you left in this role?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Brian said to me is he said, Chip, you and I have an EQ for DQ relationship. And what he meant was, Chip, you offer me your emotional intelligence, and I offer you my digital intelligence, or his design intelligence. And so a lot of the things that I feel like have been, prevalent in terms of my role there, 4 years full time, and now almost 4 years in just an advisor role, were the following things: how culture is so important to an organization. And they knew that in advance, but part of the reason they brought me on board was because I wrote a book called Peak: How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. And they'd read the book and they said, wow, we want that kind of culture-oriented organization. So culture was really important. How can you be a disruptor but still be hospitable at the same time? Back when I joined Airbnb, everybody compared Uber and Airbnb. These were the two darlings of the sharing economy world. And what I knew for sure is, culturally, we needed to be a very different company than Uber, especially because we were in the hospitality industry. So we better not be sort of seen as, just this rogue bravado company full of bravado. Airbnb in its own way is controversial because as a disruptor, you probably will be. But let's do it with a point of view where we have a long-term perspective on how we're positively impacting people. I think my influence on Brian in terms of just becoming a better leader, the proof is in the pudding. He still has his job in a year where the travel industry fell apart. And, Adam Newman doesn't have his job at WeWork. He could have used a modern elder. Travis Kalanick at Uber doesn't have his job. He could have used a modern elder. So I just think, Brian's process of becoming a better leader, I think I had some influence on that. And I would just say, finally, Brian used to say to me, Chip, you're our elder statesperson. So what that meant was I was like the Secretary of State. I was sent out into the field to deal with sometimes the groups that just hated us, or they didn't even know who Airbnb was at first. But over time, they were going to hate us potentially. The hotel industry, travel agents, the destination marketing organizations that market cities, convention meeting planners, landlords, you name it. All of those were in my sort of scope. And I quoted Gandhi on my first day on the job at Airbnb, and I said, Gandhi said back in the 1930s about the British, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. And I said that will be our arc with all of these groups. But if we're going to win, let's figure out as much as we can how to create a win-win, so it doesn't feel like a win-lose to these people who may be opposing us initially.
How did you create a win-win for the industries that Airbnb was disrupting?
Well, here's the good news. Let's use hotels as an example. Arne Sorensen, who's the CEO of the largest hotel company in the world, Marriott, ultimately he was so impressed by what we were doing, he brought his senior leadership team to Airbnb headquarters to learn from us. So did Hilton. So did Starwood. So did one other big hotel company that I can't think of right now. So they came, Hyatt. So they came to understand us more, and ultimately Marriott created their own Marriott Hotel Homes and Retreats business that's oriented toward a higher end version of Airbnb. So as I've heard from many of my hotel compatriots, if you can't beat them, join them. And so many of these companies have learned that we were open to opening our doors to teaching them about home sharing, to teaching them about millennial travel habits. And in so doing, we help them to get into the business as well.
Great. Well, let's talk about the mentorship between you and Brian. You coined a phrase or used a phrase frequently in Wisdom at Work called mutual mentorship.
Yes.
What qualities have to be in place for that to work, that student-teacher relationship?
Well, it's actually a mutual mentor. It's student teacher, teacher student. It's a right. I also use the word mentern, when you're a mentor and an intern at the same time. And so I think what needs to, often this is across generations. So Brian's a millennial, I'm a boomer. The reciprocity is at the heart of this. If you have a great mutual mentorship relationship, it basically means you have something to teach the other person and they have something to teach you. It's sort of like a yin yang, how those fit together. And in so doing, we're both better off for it. So what do you need to have? You have to have a commonality of purpose that we both want to learn from each other, a total respect and an openness to being both the student and the teacher. Because if you go into this and you just think you know it all, that isn't going to work.
Right.
And I knew for myself that at age 52, when I joined Airbnb and the average age was 26, I didn't understand a thing about tech. And it was really embarrassing at first. The first month, I almost quit 3 or 4 times because I just felt like I don't want to show how much of an idiot I am here. And I also didn't want to be a failure as like my thing I did in my 50s. But I kept coming back, and Brian would teach me about digital and design intelligence and just how do you understand, the tech world. And similarly, I had so much I could teach him about strategy and about entrepreneurship, about leadership, and of course about emotional intelligence, which is the EQ piece of it. So I think that a common respect for each other, an openness to saying what you don't know, and so that leads us to a certain amount of vulnerability, is built into the idea of a mutual mentorship relationship.
Chip, one of the questions that I think of as being emblematic of your style of leadership is a question you would often ask at Joie de Vivre, and I assume you passed on to Brian and his co-founders at Airbnb, is this question, which is, how can I help you do the best work of your life? A question you would ask of your staff. How do the answers to that question differ when you're dealing with millennials and when you're dealing with older employees?
Well, first of all, one quick note is that 40% of us in the workplace today have a boss younger than us. And by the year 2025, the majority of Americans will have a boss younger than them. So that's one thing. And if you're 55 years old, there's a 70% chance your boss is younger than you. So just know that the idea that we've never seen this before. I mean, historically, your boss was always older than you. So this is it's an interesting new phenomenon. So this question of how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at Airbnb? At Joie de Vivre, I asked the same question. I love this question for 3 reasons. Number one is you start with the question of how can I support you? And for a lot of people, they think their boss wants them to fail, which is so silly because it doesn't make your boss's job any easier if you're failing. So how can I support you helps set the ground rules to say, my role here is to serve you. So I'm a big believer in servant leadership. And that's sort of like premise is higher you are in an organization, the more you're there to serve others. But then the second part of this is, how can I support you to do the best work of your life? It's like, you want me to stretch and do the best work of my life here? And the answer is yes. I want to support you, but I also want you to stretch. But then the big piece of this that really makes it interesting is, how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at Airbnb? Well, when you put that in the lap of your direct report and say, I'm not a mind reader, I know that I want you to support you and I want you to do the best work of your life, but I want you to have agency, personal agency and responsibility to tell me what are the conditions you need to do the best work of your life. And come back to me in a week and let's sit down and we'll spend an hour going through your list. Now, this process is fascinating because for someone who is in a job and they're naturally victimized by their boss and they feel like it's easy to always complain, it puts them in a very awkward position because it makes them actually have to be the one proactively coming up with solutions. And I love that. I also love the fact that it actually, for someone who is motivated, not a victim, but just somebody who rocks it, it gives them the ability to say, I want to make a long list and let's see how many of these things we can do. But more than anything, what it does is it sets up a great conversation. And the conversation is really, here's my list of things I'd like to be able to do here, or I'd like to have as ingredients in my job, whether it's I want twice a month meetings with you instead of once a month meetings. Or I want to go to 2 personal growth, professional growth conferences a year on the company dime. Or I want to work from home 1 day a week. These are the kinds of things that could come up in those conversations, and better to have those in a conversation that's explicit than to have that person fuming about the fact that you haven't mind read what it is that they really want. And sometimes it actually sets up the conversation to say, you know what, this is not a good fit, because it makes you realize that the person's expectations of what they really want are so at odds of what you can actually offer. But that question, and my other favorite question is an interview question, which is, what's the number one way you're misperceived in the workplace? I love that question to someone I'm interviewing, because no one ever expects it coming, and it forces a certain amount of self-awareness and candor, which frankly is not all of what people bring to a job interview. They bring on their slick side and like all the good stuff. Well, when someone says, I will never forget when someone said to me, oh, the way I'm misperceived, everybody thinks I'm a really good person, but I'm really sort of a jerk. And I was like, okay, let's talk about that. So again, I think questions are meant to open up fascinating conversations.
I love that. I love that response. One of the things that came out of your experience at Airbnb was a sense of mission, which has been realized in your latest endeavor, the Modern Elder Academy. So let's talk about that. The one way to frame what MEA stands for, and just to start the ball rolling, is to end the myth that life occurs in 3 stages, where you learn, you earn, and then you burn. But to acknowledge that the middle of life is actually longer and much more potentially interesting than that.
Yeah,
but I'll turn it over to you.
You know, I after I did my 4 years at Airbnb, I came down here to southern Baja, which is about an hour north of Cabo San Lucas in Mexico, to write the book, to write Wisdom at Work: The Making of a Modern Elder. And while I was going on a running on the beach, I had a Baja aha, an epiphany, where I asked myself, why is it that we don't have schools or tools or rituals to help people in midlife repurpose themselves and maybe even change their mindset on aging? Because if you're 58 years old and you're going to live till 98, you're only halfway through your adult life if you start counting at age 18. And you can do the math yourself. For your mileage may vary in terms of what your numbers are there, but the reality is you have a lot more adult life ahead of you than you think you do. And yet, for so many people after age about 45 or 50, and depending upon the industry, if you're a software engineer, it's after age 35. So many people sort of feel like they're on the downslide for decades on end. And so to shift someone's mindset on aging was really at the heart of what we wanted to do with MEA, and to help people navigate the transitions that happen in midlife. So we started 3 years ago. For the first 6 months doing beta tests, had 13 different workshops, some 1 week, some 2 week, with a bunch of people just for free, just to bring them here, have them have their experience with a group of usually 12 to 20 people. And then we got great feedback, and we opened a couple of years ago to the public, and now have had almost 800 alums from 24 countries. And we, while I can't tell you I can't tell details yet, we are in escrow to buy a large ranch with luxury homes on it in the U.S. That will close escrow a month from now, and we will be having our first U.S. location.
Fantastic! Congratulations.
Thank you.
One of the difficulties of what you're doing at MEA is just the weight of cultural resistance, I would think, and generations of habit. How many people identify themselves with what they did prior to, the middle of their life, their job title, or raising their kids, if that's what they did, and now they face this transition, and what they need is a whole new identity. How do you enable people to make that transition?
One of the things that we really focus on is that the fact that we believe that our average age of the people coming is 54, but we've had people as young as 30 and as old as 88. So what we really believe is that people have to do an edit. We call it the great midlife edit. And it's the way we do it early in the week, and it's how people can let go of the things that are no longer serving them, mindsets, responsibilities, ways of being, habits, etc., identities, so that they can make some space for something new. When I joined Airbnb, I had to get rid of the mindset of being the CEO. I'd been CEO of my own company for 24 years. I was no longer the sage on the stage. I was the guide on the side. I was there supporting, but I was not there with my name on the marquee. And I had to right size my ego accordingly. So I think that this process of helping yourself evolve is exceptionally important. But more than anything, what people need to understand is you have created some mastery in your life along the way. And you haven't had often enough time to reflect on what it is that is world class that you could offer elsewhere. And we like to call this same seed, different soil, because you may actually have something you can offer in the world that is just in a different industry, different company. Frankly, it might even be unrelated to business. And so helping people to figure that out and to also realize that, gosh, you're not the only one in midlife who's going through transitions. And Eric, you know a little bit about this. We say that wisdom is not taught, it's shared. And if you create a crucible of a collection of maybe 18 people who are in a cohort together for a week, who are going through different transitions. Some are getting divorced. Others are actually changing career completely. Others are becoming empty nesters. Others are going through menopause. Others just had their parents pass away. To realize that transitions have sort of three phases in it. There is the ending of something. There's the messy middle, the liminal period where you're awkward. And on the other side, there is the new beginning. It's caterpillar, cocoon, butterfly. And once you start to realize that all transitions have that same frame or that paradigm, you can help yourself move and accelerate through a transition that might be painful if you didn't have the tools to do this. But we have nothing in society, no schools for midlifers that help them to understand how to apply these tools. And that's really what we're doing.
It's one thing to convince people at this phase of life that they have it in them, that they have superpowers that they can translate to another aspect of their life. It's another thing to convince society. Graduates of MEA must encounter ageism when they have ambitions to do things. How does a modern elder face down ageism?
So let me start by saying a modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise, and that curiosity really is part of the elixir of life. It's a great question, Eric, because people leave here and then they go back to the real world, and in the real world there is ageism, no doubt about it. So one of the most important things I heard in the process of writing my book, Wisdom at Work, was one of the most famous executive recruiters in the world. And she said to me, Chip, when you get your message out to people, you're going to hear all kinds of people complaining about ageism. You're going to hear about the fact that LinkedIn, there's worries that LinkedIn having your age of when you graduated from college on your LinkedIn profile is going to work against you. That companies actually have algorithms that weed out the old people. She said the most important thing for you to remember to remind people is the following. If you show up with curiosity and a passionate engagement for what you're doing, your wrinkles will disappear, and people will actually just notice your energy. And if they notice your energy, then they are no longer trying to categorize you with your age. And that's when you get to the great place. Now, the problem for many people is like they don't ever get to that interview to even be able to show the energy. And yes, is there structural ageism that's working against them? Absolutely. Probably not as bad as people think it is. But when you've been turned down for a job at age 55, 40 times, to 40 different times, you start to feel like there's something working against you that's beyond yourself. So what we really help people to do is to articulate what it is they have to offer with these extra years they've they've accumulated, whether that is being better at emotional intelligence, which is a quality that actually grows in us on average as we get older. Being able to think more holistically, systemically, connect the dots. That is a quality that we get better at with age. Be able to be a collaborator. We actually get better at collaboration and team skills. We're a little bit less self-focused. And let me just say one last thing related to this is there is a U-curve of happiness that's quite famous now in the social science research era. And it shows that around 45 to 50, we hit our low point in adulthood. And with each passing decade, 50s are better than 40s, 60s better than 50s, 70s better than 60s. We get happier and have more life satisfaction. And frankly, we're easier to be around. Now, you may have an uncle or an aunt that doesn't fit that profile, or a parent, but on average, that's true globally. And so when we help people to see that there's this U-curve of happiness and that they may be hitting bottom now, or they hit bottom 5 years ago, and that things are probably going to get better, that gives them a level of confidence to say, you know what, I'm going to go out and just go for it. Life is not just one never-ending, line downward until you die.
Chip, I love it. I think that's a great place to end it. The thought that you can be judged on your passion and your curiosity, and that makes the wrinkles go away. That's a thought to be encouraged by.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Conley,
Thank you, Eric,
for being here. And thank you all for watching. This is The Human Factor, the LinkedIn Live of Inc. and Fast Company. And I'm Eric Schurenberg. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, guys.